5 days before I was scheduled to sign the paperwork that would transfer my house and my RRSP accounts into a family trust. I went to return a library book I had renewed twice already and simply could not bring myself to finish. Hartwell Public Library had been on the same corner of King Street since before I moved to this town. I had been coming here since my husband Colin was alive, since our daughter was small enough to sit in the picture book section for 2 hours without complaint, since the winters were something I looked forward to instead of endured. Meredith at the reference desk had stamped my books every other week for going on 14 years. She knew my reading habits the way only a librarian can, the way someone knows you through what you choose to spend your quiet hours with. I came through the doors that Tuesday morning carrying a novel I had barely touched, and a small errand I expected to take 10 minutes. Meredith was behind the desk, and the moment I set the book down, she looked at me in a way I had not seen from her before, not her usual warm efficiency. Something held back, something watching. She said very quietly, "Come with me for a moment." I thought she was going to tell me about an overdue fine. I followed her through the staff door, past the sorting cart and the photocopier, into the small room where they kept processing supplies and the electric kettle and a folding table that held whatever someone had brought for the shared lunch. She closed the door. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know I've been trying to figure out how to tell you since last Thursday." Her hands were not quite steady. Mine went still. What she told me took less than 4 minutes. A man had come into the library on Thursday afternoon. She described him: tall, silver-haired, the kind of confidant that settles into a room like it owns the furniture. He had used the library's public meeting room, which anyone can book for 2 hours at a time with a valid library card. He had booked it under the name of a firm she did not recognize. She had not thought much of it until she was walking past the room to refill the paper tray in the copy room and heard, through the not quite closed door, a voice she recognized. My son-in-law Douglas. She knew Douglas because he had come to the library's estate planning seminar 2 years ago, the one the library co-hosted with a local financial firm, and she had checked him in at the door. She had a good memory for faces. That was simply her nature. What she had heard, standing very still in the hallway with a ream of copy paper in her arms, was this: the silver-haired man saying that the cognitive reassessment would need to be completed before any challenge was possible, and that once the trust activated, distributions would require his co-signature alongside the trustee, and Douglas saying, "She won't push back. She hasn't pushed back on anything since Walter died. She's not that kind of person." Meredith looked at me across the folding table. I didn't know if I'd understood it right. I still don't know if I've understood it right. But when I saw you come through the door just now, I decided that not knowing wasn't a reason to stay quiet. I looked at her for a long moment. The electric kettle had finished boiling while she was talking and was sitting there steaming quietly, waiting. "You understood it right," I said. I thanked her. I walked back through the library, past the returns desk, past the new releases display, past the children's section where my daughter had once sat for 2 hours in the picture book corner, and out into the February cold of a Tuesday morning in Hartwell, Ontario. I sat in my car in the library parking lot for a very long time. Douglas Chen had been married to my daughter Natalie for 8 years. They had met at a work conference in Toronto when she was 31 and he was 35, and he had been charming in the specific way that certain men are charming, not flashy, just smooth, the kind of smooth that wears well over time because it never overplays itself. I had thought, honestly, that he was good for her. She was sharper and more guarded after her first relationship ended badly, and Douglas made her laugh and seemed to genuinely admire her competence. He sent me a card every Mother's Day. He remembered that I took my tea without sugar. And then there was the financial advisor, a man named Stuart Price, who my son-in-law had introduced me to 11 months ago. Stuart Price had come recommended, As a specialist in estate planning for retired educators, I had taught secondary school English in Hartwell for 28 years. Colin had taught geography at the same school for 31. When Colin died 4 years ago, he left me a house that was paid for, a life insurance payout, and 2 RRSP accounts that, together with my teacher's pension, meant I was, by any reasonable measure, secure. Not wealthy, secure. The kind of secure that takes a lifetime of public service and careful living to build. "Mom," Natalie had said last spring, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands around her mug, "I just don't want what you and Dad built to get complicated. Douglas knows this guy. He's done a lot of work with retired teachers. He really knows how to protect assets like yours." She had been so careful with it, so gentle. I had trusted her. Of course I had. She was my daughter. I started the car. I drove home along the route I always drove, past the school where I still sometimes ran into former students in the grocery store, past the community centre where Colin had coached junior hockey every winter for 20 years. The house was the one we had bought in 1993, a 2-story brick on the east side of town with a backyard that backed up to the creek path, and a mudroom that had never entirely recovered from 20 years of hockey equipment. We had raised Natalie in that house. We had planted the birch tree in the front yard the year she started grade 1. Colin had died in the upstairs bedroom 3.5 years ago, and I had not once considered selling. The house was not an asset to me. It was the record of a life. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the birch tree through the window and tried to think clearly. I had signed nothing yet. The appointment was Friday. I had 5 days, and the first thing I needed to do was call someone who understood what I was dealing with. I called my oldest friend first. Beverly had been my closest friend since we taught together at Hartwell Secondary for 12 years before she retired to Barry. She listened without interrupting, which, knowing Beverly, took considerable restraint. When I finished, she said 2 words. "Call Patricia." Patricia O.C. had handled Colin's estate 4 years ago. She was a lawyer in Hartwell who had spent the first 15 years of her career in elder law before opening her own general practice. Exact, no nonsense. And the kind of lawyer who read every line of every document in front of her regardless of how much the other party wanted to move things along. Her assistant put me through within the hour. I told Patricia everything. The library, the closed door, Meredith's account, Douglas's voice, Stuart Price, the trust document that was sitting in a folder on my kitchen counter. The line was quiet when I finished. Patricia said, "Do not sign anything Friday. Do not let on to Natalie or Douglas that anything has changed. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 8:30. I slept in Colin's reading chair in the study that night because the bedroom felt too far away. The house was the same house it had always been, but it felt different, like a place that had been looked at from outside by someone measuring it. I thought about the timeline. 11 months since Douglas had introduced me to Stuart Price. 10 months since I had signed the initial consultation agreement. I thought about the small things that had happened in that time, the afternoon in November when I had completely forgotten a dental appointment. The morning I had stood in the cereal aisle at Zur's for what felt like a very long time, uncertain of a brand I had bought for 20 years. I had mentioned these things to Natalie. She had mentioned them to Douglas. I had mentioned them to Stuart Price in a meeting in September when he had asked how I was managing. I thought about the cognitive reassessment Meredith had heard discussed. Someone had been building something. I had handed them the material. I thought about Natalie, my daughter, 39 years old, who had cried at Colin's funeral with her head on my shoulder and her hand holding mine so tightly I had felt it in my bones. My daughter who called every Sunday. My daughter who had sat at my kitchen table and talked about protecting what her father and I had built and whose voice I now replayed carefully, had been her own voice, but whose language, I realized, had been someone else's. I did not know yet whether she understood what Douglas was doing. That was the question I could not yet answer, and I found, sitting in Colin's chair in the dark, that the answer mattered to me more than anything else. Patricia's office was above a pharmacy on Main Street, which had been there since the town was incorporated. She met me at the door with coffee. She closed the blinds before we sat down. She took the trust document from me and read it the way she read everything, twice, slowly, setting each page precisely face down on the desk as she finished. She tapped the second-to-last page. "This fee structure," she said. "Stuart Price takes 1.75% annually from the trust assets as an investment management fee, plus a separate service charge at his hourly billing rate for any transaction requiring authorization above $25,000. She looked at me. "On your asset base, that's somewhere between $15,000 and $18,000 per year in fees alone, embedded in language that describes it as standard administrative provisions. Did he explain this to you?" "No." "Did Douglas?" "No." She set the folder aside. "Tell me more about what was heard." I told her everything Meredith had described. Patricia made notes on a yellow legal pad. She said, "Have you noticed any actual changes in your cognition over the past several months? Anything that genuinely alarmed you?" I thought about it honestly. A forgotten appointment. A blank moment in a grocery store, the kind of thing that happens to people at 63 who are 4 years into grief and sleeping badly. "Small things," I said. "I told Natalie about them. She told Douglas." Patricia put her pen down. "Someone has been building a record, not to protect you, to use." She stood and walked to the bookshelf behind her desk and came back with a thin reference volume opened to a page she clearly already knew. "Financial elder abuse in Ontario," she said, "is covered under the Substitute Decisions Act and the Criminal Code. Fraudulent documentation of cognitive incapacity to support unlawful transfer of assets is a serious criminal matter. Concealment of material fees in a trust instrument is a regulatory violation with the Financial Services Regulatory Authority." She paused. "If Price structured this trust to extract fees he never disclosed, if Douglas directed that, if there was coordination with any physician to manufacture a capacity assessment, we can pursue every piece of it, but I need evidence beyond a second-hand account of a conversation through a library wall." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. A name. "Frank Aguilar, retired RCMP, 15 years in financial crimes before he left the force. He's quiet, he's thorough, and he charges a reasonable flat rate." She paused. "What do you want to do about Friday?" "I'm going to call Natalie tonight and tell her I have a terrible head cold and need to postpone." Patricia nodded. "Tell her you'll confirm a new date early next week. Don't give a specific day. That buys us time." I drove home through Hartwell in the February grey, past the library, past the school, past the community centre. I called Natalie from the kitchen at 4:30. Her voice was warm and immediately concerned. She said, "Oh, Mum, you sound terrible. Take care of yourself. We'll reschedule. It's no problem at all." Her voice was her voice. I listened through it carefully and could not hear the bottom of it. She said, "I love you, Mom." I said, "I love you too, sweetheart." I held the phone after we hung up and tried to understand how both things could be true at once. Frank Aguilar arrived at my house the following morning carrying a canvas briefcase and wearing a barn jacket that made him look like someone's retired uncle rather than a former RCMP financial crimes investigator. He was 61, soft-spoken, and had the quality of someone who had been professionally lied to for many years and had developed a very finely calibrated sense for it. I told him everything from the beginning. He asked 3 questions and took notes without any visible reaction until I finished. He said, "The trust document, may I keep a copy?" He took it. He said, "I'll need Douglas's full name, date of birth, employer." Price, FSRA registration number if you have it, any other advisors or professionals named in the document. He had most of what he needed. He stood at my front door to leave and said one thing, "Your daughter. Do you believe she knows the full scope of what Price was setting up, or do you think she was told this was standard estate planning?" I thought about Natalie at my kitchen table, her hands around her mug, her voice, her face, the language that had been hers and not hers at the same time. "I don't know," I said. "That's the thing I most need to understand," Frank nodded slowly. "That's the right thing to need to understand." He left. Beverly drove down from Barrie that evening, and we sat at the kitchen table and laid out 11 months of documents in chronological order: the initial consultation summary, the trust outline, the fee agreement, the signing date confirmation, methodical, each one building on the last, each one slightly more complex, slightly more obscure than the one before. Beverly said, "He knew you were alone. He knew you were still grieving. He walked you toward this one page at a time." At 9:40 that night, my phone showed a text from Frank. Significant findings. "Can I come by tomorrow at noon? Bring your lawyer." Patricia arrived at 11:50. Frank came at noon precisely. He set his briefcase on the kitchen table and opened it and produced 2 folders and the printed document. The first folder was Stuart Price. He had a regulatory complaint filed with FSHRA in 2021 involving a client in London, Ontario, a 71-year-old widow who had lost over $180,000 in undisclosed fees across 3 years before her niece retained a lawyer and forced an audit. The complaint had been settled under terms that seal the specifics. There was a second complaint, not yet resolved, from a client in Guelph, a pattern, recently widowed women, adult children who functioned as intermediaries and appeared to be acting in good faith, trust structures with fee provisions buried in boilerplate. He specifically targets retired educators and civil servants, Frank said, because they tend to have clean asset profiles, defined benefit pensions, paid-off properties, modest investments, and because they tend to trust professional advice. Patricia leaned forward. The fee structure in the document in front of her mirrored the London, Ontario case with the kind of specificity that wasn't coincidental. The second folder was Douglas. Before Douglas had moved into financial consulting, he had worked for 3 years at an estate planning firm in Calgary. Frank had spoken off the record with a former colleague there. Douglas had left under circumstances that were described, carefully and obliquely, as involving questions about how client referrals were being directed to third-party advisors. Nothing had been prosecuted, nothing was on record, but he had a working knowledge of how trust documents were constructed, which provisions transferred authority, which clauses buried fees that clients wouldn't notice for years. He brought Price to this deliberately, Frank said. He understood exactly what he was looking at in this document. Patricia looked at me. I looked at the second folder. "What about my daughter?" I said. Frank considered his words carefully. "Your daughter signed one document as a secondary trustee designate. Based on everything I can find, she was told this was standard asset protection planning. The originating relationship was between Douglas and Price. The structure was built before Natalie was brought in." He paused. "She may not know what she agreed to." The room was very quiet. I had already been thinking about what to do since the night I sat in Colin's reading chair. I had thought about calling Natalie privately before anything else. I had thought about simply not signing and letting the whole thing dissolve without confrontation. I had thought about every way to handle it that didn't require looking at the truth directly in a room full of people. And then I thought about the woman in London, Ontario, her $180,000, her niece who had caught it, and the woman in Guelph who hadn't caught it yet. "I want to reschedule the signing," I said. "This Sunday afternoon, here at this house. Tell them I'm ready and the cold is cleared. I want Douglas and Natalie and Price all here together." Patricia looked at me carefully. And then I want to finish it. I spent Saturday making the house clean and the kitchen warm. I made Colin's butter tart recipe, the one he had made every December for the school staff party, and that filled the whole house with the smell of brown sugar and cold winter. I sat at his desk in the study and looked at his photograph for a long time. I told him what I was about to do. I told him I was more frightened than I had expected to be. I told him the frightened part did not change anything. Beverly arrived at 1 o'clock to sit with me and be a witness. Howard Park, who had been the department head of science at Hartwell Secondary for 20 years and who I trusted with my life, arrived at 1:30. Patricia came with a colleague from her office. Frank sat in the corner of the living room with his briefcase and his barn jacket and his very quiet eyes. At 2:50, I heard a car in the driveway. I stood at the kitchen window and watched Natalie and Douglas come up the front walk. Natalie was wearing her good coat, the grey wool one. She was carrying the small overnight bag she always brought when she came to stay, which told me she had expected this to be celebratory, expected to stay the night afterward. Douglas had his leather portfolio under his arm. Stuart Price's car pulled in behind theirs. I opened the front door and smiled. Natalie hugged me with her whole body, the way she had hugged me since she was small. She smelled like the same conditioner she had used since university. She said, "You sound so much better. How are you feeling?" "Much better," I said. "Come in." I made butter tarts. Douglas kissed my cheek and said the house looked wonderful. Price shook my hand with both of his and said he was glad I was feeling better and that he was looking forward to getting this sorted out for me. The voice of a man who believed the next hour would go very smoothly. I brought them into the dining room. Patricia and Beverly and Howard were seated along the far wall. Price stopped when he saw them, recovered, and set his briefcase on the table with a small smile that suggested he was accustomed to widows who brought extra people to signings. "Before we get started," he said, "I'd like to walk everyone through the document one final time, just so we're all comfortable." I said, "I'd like to say something first, if that's all right." "Of course." He gestured pleasantly. I looked at my daughter. Natalie was watching me with the attentive, slightly careful expression that had been on her face for 4 years now, since Colin died. The expression of someone listening for something that might need managing. She had gotten that from me, I think. The tendency to watch for things that might need fixing. I recognized it because it came from somewhere. 4 years ago, I said, your father sat in this room and told me that the thing I was worst at was asking for help when I needed it. He said, "Carol, you have spent your whole career looking after other people's children. Let someone look after you sometimes." I told him he was being dramatic. I stopped. He wasn't wrong. Natalie's face softened. Douglas was very still. Price smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks a sentimental opening is working in his favor. "I tried to do better," I said. "This past year, I tried to let people help me. I trusted the advice I was given. I didn't ask enough questions because asking questions felt ungrateful, and because I was tired, and because grief makes you want things to be simple." I looked at the document on the table. "This document is not simple." I nodded to Frank. He opened his briefcase and placed 2 folders and the printed document on the table, the same way he had placed them in front of Patricia and me 2 days before. I looked at Price. "The investment management fee in Section 6 of this document is 1.75% annually of all trust assets, with a separate service charge at your billing rate for any transaction above $25,000. This was not explained to me at any point in 11 months of meetings. On the assets you were proposing to manage, that is somewhere between $15,000 and $18,000 per year in fees that would come directly from what my husband and I built." I looked at my daughter. "He never told you it was in there." Natalie looked at Douglas. Price said, "I think there may be some confusion about how the fee provisions are structured. If we could all just review Patricia said clearly, The fee provision is on page 9, section 6, subsection 2. It is embedded in a block of text that begins with the words standard administrative and operational costs. This is the same fee structure used in a trust arrangement that resulted in a settled regulatory complaint against Mr. B. Price filed with FSRA in 2021, involving a client in London, Ontario. Douglas's hands were flat on the table. I opened the first folder and turned it to face Natalie. Price's name at the top, the London complaint summary, the Guelph matter, the pattern, widowed women, recently retired adult children who brought them the referral. Natalie's face did not move in the way that faces move when something is news. It moved in the way that faces move when something that was suspended finally lands. I said, before Douglas worked in financial consulting, he worked at an estate planning firm in Calgary. He left after questions were raised about how client referrals were being directed to third-party advisors. I looked at my daughter carefully. He knew what was in this document before he gave it to you to give to me. He built this. Natalie looked at her husband. Douglas said, "That's a mischaracterization of what happened in Calgary. I left that firm on entirely professional terms, and I have nothing to—" "The man who came to the library," I said. He went quiet. "The meeting room at Hartwell Public Library. Last Thursday, you and Stuart Price. The not quite closed door." I looked at him steadily. I was told there would need to be a cognitive reassessment before any challenge was possible. That once the trust activated, distributions would require co-signature. That I would not push back. I paused. That I was not that kind of person. The room was silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when something irrevocable has been said. Price stood up. "I don't think there's anything to be gained by continuing," Patricia said. "Please sit down, Mr. Price. There are 2 officers from the Hartwell Police Service Financial Crimes Unit currently in the parking area. They have been briefed on the matter. If you leave this room, I will make a call." Price sat. I looked at Douglas. I had been trying to understand this man for 8 years, and I had not understood him, not the underneath of him, not the part that could sit at my kitchen table and talk about protecting what Colin and I had built while already knowing what he was building. He looked now, the way certain people look when the face they have been wearing for years is removed too quickly. Not angry, not sorry, just suddenly smaller. He said, "I wasn't going to leave her destitute. There would have been distributions. She would have been taken care of." Natalie said very quietly, "Stop." He looked at her. She said, "Don't say anything else." Patricia stood. "Stuart Price, you are being referred to the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario for investigation of fee concealment, breach of fiduciary duty, and financial elder abuse under the Criminal Code of Canada." Douglas. She looked at him. "The question of your involvement and liability is currently being assessed, and you will be hearing from our office." The 2 officers came to the door. Price left without speaking and without looking at anyone. He looked, in the end, exactly as small as he was. Douglas looked at Natalie. She did not look back at him. She picked up her bag, the overnight bag she had brought expecting to celebrate, and she walked out of the dining room into the front hall. I heard the door open and close. Douglas left. The room was quiet. Howard poured water. Beverly put her hand on my shoulder. Patricia gathered her documents with her usual quiet efficiency. Natalie came back. She had not left. She had gone to the front hall, and she had stood there, and she had come back. She sat down in the chair where she had been sitting, and she looked at the table, and she did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" 5 days, I said. She put her hands over her face. "Mom." She stopped. Started again. "He told me Price was the best. He told me you had been forgetting things, that you'd mentioned it yourself, that the trust was the responsible thing. He said," she stopped. "He said you were the kind of person who would never ask for help, and that if we didn't do something you would just quietly let things get out of hand and be too proud to say anything." That part wasn't entirely wrong, I said. She looked up. I'm not good at asking for help, I said. Your father said so too. When I pulled back after he died, when I kept you at arm's length because I didn't want you to see how badly I was struggling, you read that as me being fine. Douglas read it differently. He looked at my closed door and found an opening. I paused. That was not your fault, but I helped make the space. Natalie was very quiet for a moment. She said, I signed a document as a secondary trustee. I know. I didn't read it, she said. I trusted him. He said it was standard language. Her voice was not making excuses. It was being precise. I should have read it. I should have come to you first, instead of coming with a plan already made. Yes, I said. But Natalie, you thought you were protecting me. I did, she said. And I didn't ask you if you needed protecting. I just decided you did. She looked at the table. That's the same thing he counted on in all of them, isn't it? The ones in London and Guelph. Someone who loved them deciding on their behalf. It was. In the months that followed, the house settled back into being the house it had always been. The birch tree came through to spring. Beverly drove down every few weeks. Howard came for dinner on Fridays. The Sunday calls with Natalie were slightly longer than they had been before, slightly less careful, slightly more honest. We were learning something that we probably should have learned 4 years ago, when Colin died and we had both been so frightened that we had each gone quiet and called it strength. Stuart Price registration with FSRA was suspended in March pending investigation. The criminal refer was proceeding. Patricia had connected the woman from Guelph with a lawyer. 3 other clients had come forward through the regulatory inquiry, all of them women in their 60s, all of them retired, all of them alone, none of them people I knew, all of them people who had trusted a professional at the wrong time. The woman from London, Ontario got her case reopened. That felt like something. I requested a cognitive assessment voluntarily in April through my family doctor, conducted by a neuropsychologist at the Regional Health Centre. 2 half-days of testing. Her report came back in May. No evidence of impairment. Memory, reasoning, and processing all within normal range for my age. She told me, with some amusement, that I had noticed an error in her scoring sheet and pointed it out before she did. She said not many of her patients did that. I did not have it framed. But I thought about it on the hard days. Natalie called the following Sunday and asked if she could come for the weekend. She arrived with groceries rather than flowers, which I appreciated more. She knew me well enough to know that. We spent Saturday afternoon in the kitchen and I taught her Colin's butter tart recipe because I had decided that was the right recipe to teach her and the right day to teach it. We ate at the table where, 2 months before, I had laid out 2 folders and a printed document and ended something. It looked like an ordinary kitchen table now. It was. After we cleaned up, Natalie sat with her hands around her mug and said, I've been seeing someone, a therapist. We've been talking about how I relate to you, about what I thought was happening with you after Dad died and what was actually happening. She looked at her tea. She asked me when I stopped trusting your judgment, and I had to think about it for a long time. I think it was right after he died. I think I needed you to be fragile because it gave me something to do, because I didn't know how to just be sad without trying to fix something. I know, I said. I know that feeling. She looked up. She's been helping me understand that taking care of someone and making decisions for them are not the same thing. No, I said, they're not. I thought about Colin, his patience with me, his willingness to say difficult things gently, but without softening them into something false. Your father was very good at telling me when I was wrong without making me feel small. I always wanted that between us too, you and me. I paused. We haven't always managed it. Natalie looked at her mug. I know. Then can we try? Yes, I said. I think we can. On the last Saturday of April, I drove to the cemetery on the east side of Hartwell and sat with Colin for a while. The maples were just starting, that thin first green that lasts about 4 days before it deepens, and the light was the kind of April light that makes everything look provisional and possible at the same time. I told him everything. The library, Murder's face, the folders on the table, the offices at the door. I told him about Natalie and the butter tarts and the therapist and the long Sunday calls. I told him the house was still ours, not mine, ours, that it had always felt that way. The wind moved through the early maples, and I sat there until my hands were cold, and then I drove home along the route I knew by heart, through the downtown and past the school and over the creek bridge and into the driveway under the birch tree that was 31 years old now, older than Natalie had been when we planted it. I went inside and put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen in the quiet that was mine. If you stayed with me through all of that, I want to tell you something honestly, because I've been sitting with it since the Sunday afternoon when everything came apart at my own dining room table, and it has not left me since. I spent a long time being angry at Douglas. I still am, in the clear, uncomplicated way that you are angry at someone who looked at your grief as an opening. But the harder thing, the thing I've been slower to say out loud, is that he was right about one part of me. I am not easy to help. I close the door when things hurt. I perform competence when what I actually want is someone to sit with me in the kitchen and not say anything useful at all. After Colin died, I pulled back from everyone who loved me, including my daughter, and I told myself it was strength. It was not strength. It was the habit of a woman who had been self-sufficient for so long that asking for anything felt like failure. People who exploit grief and isolation need a way in. Sometimes they find it because they are calculating and cruel. But sometimes the door is already standing open because the people who should have been walking through it were kept at arm's length by someone who didn't know how to let them in. I don't say that to excuse what was done to me or to the women in London and Guelph or to the others who came forward. None of us did anything wrong. We trusted the people who were supposed to advise us. We loved the people who were supposed to love us back. That is not a failing. But the other part is also true, and it is worth saying. Don't let the cost of asking for help become higher than the cost of not asking. It took me 5 days and a librarian who paid attention to understand that. I wish it had taken less. Thank you for being here. If something in this felt familiar, if you've ever been in a room with someone you loved and realized you had both been very quiet for too long, I would be glad to hear about it in the comments. I read all of them, and if you're not subscribed yet, I hope you'll stay. I have more to share. The thing I keep coming back to months later is not the folders on the dining room table or the officers in the parking lot or the look on Douglas's face when the mask came off faster than he expected. What I keep coming back to is Meredith, standing in a library hallway with a ream of copy paper in her arms, deciding that not being certain was not the same as staying silent. She could have told herself she had misunderstood. She could have decided it wasn't her place. She had known me for 14 years through book returns and reading recommendations, not through anything that would have obligated her to walk into something difficult on my behalf. But she paid attention anyway. She held what she had heard carefully, turned it over, and when she saw me come through the door, she made a choice about what kind of person she wanted to be in that moment. That kind of quiet moral courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just acts when acting is the right thing, is something I had always admired from a distance without understanding how close it lives to ordinary daily life. It lives right there, in a hallway, with copy paper. I think about what allowed Douglas to build what he built over 11 months, and the honest answer is that it required more than his own calculation. It required my silence. Not silence about the scheme. I didn't know about that. Silence about the grief, the hard mornings, The moments when I stood in the cereal aisle and couldn't remember a brand I had bought since Natalie was in grade 3. I told those things to my daughter, and she told her husband, and he filed them away and called them useful. I gave him the material because I had spent 4 years performing competence so thoroughly that the small cracks, when they showed, looked more significant than they were. There is a kind of intelligence that is not about being clever. It is about being honest with yourself in the moments when honesty is uncomfortable. I was not honest about how much I was struggling. I was not honest with Natalie, which meant she filled the silence with her own interpretation, and Douglas filled it with something worse. Clear thinking, the kind that actually protects you, begins with accurate self-knowledge. It begins with being willing to say, I am not managing as well as I look. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of judgment. And then there is what it takes to do what I did that Sunday. To sit with Colin's photograph on Saturday night, knowing what the next afternoon would require, and to walk to that front door anyway and smile and say, come in, I made butter tarts. People sometimes talk about strength as if it arrives when you are not afraid. That has not been my experience. Strength, in my experience, is being thoroughly frightened and doing the necessary thing anyway. Not because you feel ready, but because you understand that waiting to feel ready is its own kind of choice. Natalie is learning that distinction too. She said it to me herself, in the kitchen, with her hands around a mug. In the careful, honest way she is learning to speak. Taking care of someone and making decisions for them are not the same thing. It took both of us a long time and a very bad several months to understand that clearly. I wish it had taken less, but I am glad we arrived at it together. What happened to me happened because one person chose greed, one person chose not to ask the questions he should have asked, and I chose for 4 years to keep my door mostly closed. The consequences flowed from all 3 of those choices in a direction that made a certain kind of sense, once I could see it plainly. And the undoing of it flowed just as plainly from Meredith paying attention, Patricia reading every line, Frank being thorough, Beverly driving down from Barry, and me deciding, in Colin's chair in the dark, that I was not finished yet. None of us goes through something like this unchanged. I am more careful now, more willing to let people close enough to actually help. More willing to say, I don't understand this, explain it to me again, when a professional is talking fast and hoping I won't ask. Those are not small things. They cost me something to learn. I would rather they hadn't cost me this much. But the birch tree is still in the front yard. The house still smells like whatever I made for dinner the night before. And on Sunday afternoons, sometimes, Natalie calls and we talk for a long time about nothing in particular. That is enough. That is actually quite a lot.